Welcome to the 2022 Minnesota Northwoods Writers Conference Reading Series. My name is Sean Hill, and I'm the conference director. This is our 8th conference, our first online. And this evening, we're about to hear the 5th of our 6 readers this week, Meera Subramanian. I can't believe we only have one more reading after tonight. It's been a great week. We just had a fantastic participant reading. Gotten to know some new people in this format. One of them is Meera, and I've had a really good time getting to know her some this week. I'm so glad that she accepted our invitation to teach at the conference. And I'm excited.
An absolute pleasure.
I'm so excited to hear her read. Yeah. We've gathered a small gallery to give Meera a sense of all of you out there gathered this evening. We will represent you well. Sarah Dennison, our conference administrator, will moderate the Q&A with me following the reading. But before we get started, there are a few people and entities I need to thank on behalf of the conference and myself. We want to thank the poets collected in the New Poets of Native Nations anthology and Hyde Erdrich, its editor, and Grey Wolf Press for their generous donation and support of the New Poets of Native Nations Women's Scholarship. We also want to thank an anonymous past MNWC participant for their generous donation in support of the Charles W. Scrutcheon Emerging Writer of Color Scholarship. The conference is supported in part by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Minnesota State Arts Board, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. So thank you, Minnesotans. And we want to thank Bemidji State for their support and encouragement. We are grateful for our place in the Northwoods at Bemidji State University, beside the lake known as Bemidjigamog, where the river crosses, which has been the sacred gathering place for countless generations of indigenous peoples, including Dakota, Lakota, and Anishinaabeg, whom remain the spiritual caretakers and thriving members of the greater community to which we all belong, situated as we are between 3 Ojibwe reservations, Leech Lake, White Earth, and Red Lake. We recognize and support the sovereignty of Native nations. We will continue to work with Indigenous teachers, elders, and youth to protect and honor all our relationships with the land, all our relatives, and the truth. Meera Subramanian is an award-winning freelance journalist whose work has been published around the world. Her writing has been anthologized in Best American Science and Nature Writing and in multiple editions of Best Women's Travel Writing. Meera's narrative nonfiction book, A River Runs Again, India's Natural World in Crisis, was a 2016 Orion Book Award finalist. She investigated the perceptions of climate change among conservative Americans in her 2018 book, Finding Middle Ground, Conversations Across America About Climate Change. Meera has been a Fulbright Nehru Senior Research Fellow in India and a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT. She was most recently the Curry C. and Thomas A. Barron Visiting Professor in the Environment and the Humanities at Princeton University. Meera is currently serving as the president of the Society of Environmental Journalists. It is with great pleasure we give you Meera Subramanian. Please, gallery, unmute yourselves. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sean, for that kind introduction and for the invitation to be part of this amazing community. This week has been really phenomenal, really while we're not all there in the Northwoods, we are all there in the Northwoods. There's been so much wonderful reading and writing and speaking about it. But at the same time, we've also gone to the Bay of Fundy, and we've looked out the window in Arizona, and we've just been all over, and it really has felt like a journey. So thank you to everybody. It was wonderful to hear participants reading today and get a taste of all that's happening in all the different workshops. And it was great talking with Liz during the craft talk about all the different hats. That intro just reminded me, I wear a lot of different hats. And so, so I wanted to try to bring some of that together tonight with what I want to read. I've been thinking a lot about climate change lately. I think a lot of people are. It's been great hearing poems about the Anthropocene and all the different ways that this manifests. And I'm going to read one longer piece that was in Orion over the winter that evolved from a whole series, a 9-part series that I did for Inside Climate News about perceptions of climate change in conservative parts of America. So I'm going to read that, and I'm going to show some photographs from that there too, from some of the reporting, so that you can really, since I can't read all 9 pieces, and I can only give you little tiny snippets of some of them, I'm going to share some pictures along the way too. And then I'll read a shorter piece at the end. So I'm going to just jump in and share my screen. So this whole series was called Finding Middle Ground: Conversations Across America. So this will give you a sense of where I went, and I'm just gonna jump in and start reading. So this was again in the Orion in the winter issue of this. So after going to 9 places, a lot of things started bubbling up and didn't fit into any of the individual pieces. So this was what feels like really just the beginning of me still trying to process everything that I experienced during that 1.5 years of traveling. It's called United in Change. For the past couple of years, I traveled across my country, falling in love with strangers. I sought them out: farmers, ranchers, fly fishermen, evangelicals, and stepped into their lives, uninvited, but nearly always inexplicably welcome. I sought some kind of connection, asking them questions few seem to be asking them about their lives and what they care about and what they believe in, who they vote for and why, what they remember from before and what they expect in the future, which to their collective grief are often different things. I spent time with a Georgian peach farmer who faced a failed crop because the winter never got cold enough to set the fruit. I met ranchers in North Dakota who'd been devastated by a sudden and severe drought that had turned spring grass into stubble that left their cattle starved. A frustrated Republican fly fisherman from Montana longed for the conservation-minded Teddy Roosevelt of his party, who might care about the increasing numbers of rivers closed to fishing because the waters were too low to fish and too warm. There were a dog sledding father and daughter losing their sport because of erratic snowfall, and a coal country community struggling to explain why 8 of their citizens were swept away in a flood, and young evangelicals turning to God to justify climate action. I sought them out because I wanted to see what climate change looks like, up close, see its impacts on those who grow our food and fuel our power. The uncertainty it causes for people who live to race their dogs through snow or spend their afternoons fishing. What are the perceptions of those experiencing the changes underway to every aspect of American life, of human life, of life? I found these strangers by scouring presidential election maps from the fall of 2016 down to the county level and searching for red, really red. And then I looked for places that seemed to be on the front lines of climate change. I went as a journalist looking for stories of these lost Americas, but I was also looking for something else. I think of it as love, but perhaps it was simply civility, which seems a suitable replacement for love these days in America, and rarer. The 2016 election laid bare how divided our country was, each side seemingly incapable of seeing the other's points of view. News reports were filled with stories about the raging poles of the political spectrum, no room any longer for the middle, on climate or anything else. The months leading up to the election and the time since had left me feeling beaten down, like a child of parents on the verge of divorce, everything steeped in rancor, the capacity for dialogue broken, the sides separated by an insurmountable barrier. When Inside Climate News came to me with an idea for a series about conservative perceptions of climate change, I thought it might give me a chance to attempt to climb that barrier, to cross over what sociologist Arlie Russell Hochschild called the empathy wall. Know this, I did not vote for Trump. I walked through the empty streets of Cambridge on November 8th under the silent glow of streetlights, gutted as I contemplated what was in store for my stepdaughters as they stepped into womanhood, for my immigrant cousin who had recently been told to speak English on a Massachusetts beach, for my brown-skinned father whose marriage to my white mother was illegal in many US states back in 1964, for the future of an agreement so recently secured in Paris, for all the people who didn't look like our new president-elect, and for the non-human lives that never make the campaign slogans of either party. I didn't look like most of the people I met in my travels. The red maps led me to white, rural counties, places that went overwhelmingly for a president who has referred to climate change as a hoax, stupid, nonsense. But these are also places where the implications of a warming world aren't speculative. Many I met work intimately with the land, the peach farmer waiting for cold winter nights, the dryland rancher waiting for spring rains, the West Virginia cop worrying over river rise. The louder voices on climate activism may come from blue coastal states, but the red states are arguably paying greater cost of impacts now, today. Most everyone I sought out had voted for Mr. Trump, though few spoke with the rage that sears our scorched social media landscape. What I experienced standing with people in their home places were humans hamstrung by the polarization of an issue that no longer has anything to do with atmospheric chemistry. I met people hindered from even uttering the phrase climate change, even as they lost the very things that define their lives, the surety of spring rains, ripe peaches in mid-July, snow in a Wisconsin winter. But I set out not to lecture, but listen. I'd had it with hashtag conversations of either political persuasion. I went to listen because the partisan divide that was once a rift had suddenly grown into a chasm, and I was no longer strong enough to shout across it. The more I spoke of climate change in my life and in my work, the more the temperatures seemed to rise above us and between us. The schism was growing, and it was clear how catastrophically facts on their own can fail. So I went searching for stories instead. It was peak summer, a sunny day in July, when I met a peach farmer named like 4 of his 5 forefathers after the Confederate hero and Union villain, Robert E. Lee. Robert's family has grown peaches for 120 years. He learned from his now elderly father and was teaching his grown son, who both drifted into the office over the course of our interview. They all spoke candidly of the failed harvest and the too warm winter, but shut down when I mentioned Inside Climate News, the outlet for whom I was reporting. It's just the weather, they insisted. Could be cold as the dickens next year, the grandfather told me. Suddenly, some urgent business materialized elsewhere, and they had to go. After that, I hung around the shelves of peach jams and peach confections and white rocking chairs like a stray dog, looking at the open-air processing line that had been shuttered 2 months early because of the failed harvest. Workers left jobless. When Robert saw me looking longingly at a bus full of school children pulling up for a tour, he took pity on me, told me to hop in his truck. We drove past the ruins of an old cotton gin to get to peach orchards, leafy and lovely, but with stunted fruit he called buttons, if they had any fruit at all. A peach, the essence of summer, starts making itself deep within a dormant bud in the coldest, darkest days of winter. It requires a certain number of what are known as chill hours. That year, the cold never came. The year before had been warm as well. Are you worried? I asked. He shrugged. How many more seasons like this before you take to switching to warmer weather varieties? Maybe one, he said, laughing half-heartedly, but he was more worried about other things. His harvest had failed, yes, but it was easier to hold out hope for next year's crop than for the return of his community. All sense of opportunity seemed vanished. Anyone who did well in school left, he told me, and those who remained didn't want the hard work of the orchards. I read accounts from the region about the festive harvest season in the early 1900s, when college boys, quote, filled the peach towns with lively, lusty times. They picked and packed peaches all day and then headed into town to dance with girls come sundown. No one paused to consider if those college boys would ever return once they got their degrees. I grew up in the Northeast, but I lived in Georgia once, not far from Robert's Peach Farm. I was in a University of Georgia undergraduate biology class 30 years ago when I first heard about a thing called global warming. Should it continue, my professor warned us, local farmers would no longer be able to grow peaches. It was just one bit of information in a deluge of coursework, but the data point settled in me like a seed. I landed in Georgia after traveling around the world on a ship where I'd become consumed by what are emerging as the great questions of the 21st century. How can humans live rich lives on a planet with limited natural resources? How do we reconcile the needs of the planet's growing population with the rights of the rest of the Earth's places and inhabitants? How might we close the unceasing gap between the haves and the have-nots? Back then, answering these questions for me meant door knocking around Atlanta suburbs to raise support for the radical act of curbside recycling. It's quaint now to think that that was the battleground. In the 3 decades since then, humans have burned more than half of the fossil fuels we've ever burned. And the global recycling system, now that Americans have finally gotten the handle of it, has basically collapsed. I wasn't long in Athens. I was a lusty college girl who didn't see any opportunities amid the rolling hills of Georgia, so I left the rural South for the Pacific Northwest, where there were jobs along Seattle's steep asphalt roads and the added allure of being surrounded by what felt like rank wilderness and abundant waters. But I didn't last long in the city either. Within a handful of years, I'd moved onto 40 acres in rural Oregon, where I found a community of impoverished people making a rich life for themselves. We grew our own food, built our own houses, and dug ditches in the middle of the night when the rains came down too hard, piercing the watery darkness. Together, we fought for old-growth forests, protested global capitalism, read Noam Chomsky and Winona LaDuke and Wendell Berry. I knew people who served time for monkey wrenching and one who died when he fell from the work in the treetops. There in the woods of Oregon, I realized that the political spectrum is not a spectrum at all. It is not a band with gradations from red to blue. It is a circle made with a spirograph, with earth firsters and homeschooled Christians overlapping here and diverging there. You never knew who might own a gun or believe in God. I left Oregon too, of course. I never quite fit the activist life, weary of confrontation and too reluctant to get arrested. So I headed to grad school in New York City in my 30s. I still wrestled with those same questions, but I wanted to explore them from the vantage of a journalist, where stories and science could lead the way. Perhaps I seem a malcontent with all that movement, but it never felt like fleeing. Instead, it felt more like place collecting. Each location I'd ever lived left its imprint, made itself my home, plastered a layer on my mosaic heart like a patchwork quilt of place. Some part of me remains pining for those past places still. But were they even still there? While I stood with the peach farmer in middle Georgia and heard his lament for his changing place, my once homeland of the Pacific Northwest was on fire. The fires now come every season, though they were rare when I lived there just 15 years ago. Barren peach trees, flooded hollows, flaming forest. Dislocation often refers to the loss of equilibrium experienced within the confines of our mind, but also signified the disturbance of a body part, like a shoulder or a knee. Its root draws on the word place. With our mindless daily actions, Robert farms, I travel, we require ancient carbon to be unearthed and burned for our benefit, and so together, alter the planet. Climate change transforms the word dislocation into a literal upending of place. The mind tilts in response toward longing or anger or desperate search for certainty. Because what we know about our world, we have learned by looking to the past, whether considering our individual lives or what the fate of human society might be. It is the past, the steady experience of seasons throughout history that sets our expectations for the future. Such a fine model of existence is no longer relevant. Quote, the assumption that current and future climate conditions will resemble the recent past is no longer valid, the latest National Climate Assessment states. Standing in the peach orchards of Georgia, holding the button of a peach that never reached its potential, I had the troubling sense that nothing was or ever could be the same. Months later, I was in Divide County, North Dakota, smack up against the Canadian border, sitting in the kitchen of a cattle rancher named Byron. He'd gathered his neighbors, some driving 30 miles to meet me, muddy boots collected by Byron's back door, and everyone was seated around the table, drinking coffee and answering my questions about the drought that had come fast and furious the prior season. One rancher named Jim brought the conversation back to New York, where I'd mentioned having lived. He'd been thinking about that city the other day. He said, I had a cow in the chute and we were going to pull a calf, and it's a strain for the cow. I was right behind. Eyeball the asshole, another rancher interjected. Jim nodded and continued. And well, it was time to go to the bathroom, and I ducked. I saw it coming, but I got a shot down the neck and side of the head, and I was thinking, he shook his head, I wonder if these frickin' New Yorkers know just what we do to put that steak on the table. A chorus of agreement rose up from the men. They also agreed that climate change wasn't the cause of their predicament. Sure, they were one more drought away from liquidation. Sure, but heat wasn't the only problem. They'd thrown global warming out the window, and the spring had been bitter cold after all. And they'd seen this all before. Some spoke of a particularly bad drought back in the 1980s. Others defended their improved methods now that they keep weeds at bay with combines and chemicals instead of the repetitive disruption of tillage that used to cause so much soil erosion. They did not mention what those chemicals do to soil health or water quality. They spoke of their connection to the land instead. It's pretty tough to find anybody besides a farmer rancher that loves Mother Earth as much as we do, Byron said. We work with it every day. The folks in Byron's corner of the Dakotas, a sparse place of prairie potholes abundant with waterfowl and the platforms of flaming fracking fields, were fiercely proud of how hard life could be there and how well they managed in spite of that fact. You might get yourself caught in a ditch, but you had neighbors you could call for help. And the guys in Byron's kitchen, they called each other a lot. Of the 7 men, only 2 were married, though most were in their 50s and 60s. When I asked why, they said all the girls went off to college and married somebody else. Few wanted to come back and be a rancher's wife. Loss comes in many forms. When biologists call a species functionally extinct, they don't mean that it's disappeared completely. Individuals of a functionally extinct species may still exist, but there are not enough of them to ensure survival. Their ecosystem has been shattered. The threads that link them to the rest of their world are stretched too tight, and at that point, it's only a matter of time. No wife to share the load, no children to sass, no grandchildren to spoil. A naturally sparse landscape becomes vacant in a new way, a twist on the same abandonment in the streets of Detroit. Communities dismantle. Those who remain dig in body and mind both. As I sat with the men, I remembered the ditches of my own past, digging in the dark, in the rain, with the friends who made up my community. I remembered the sweet stench of slaughter, our hands together in the blood, and the disappointment when a crop failed. I'd gotten a steady $400 each month from the nonprofit where I worked at the time, plus room and board, so livelihood wasn't at stake, just my labor, my time, my hope. I remembered moving from a barn on 20 acres to a studio apartment in New York City and realizing that few people I met had any clue what sustained them. A decade at the end of my dirt road in Oregon, pre-internet with no television and only a humble small town library, had left me an idiot by New York standards. What was Sex in the City? Who was Foucault? But I knew I had how to build a staircase and what kind of Douglas fir tree would be big enough to mill the lumber required to do it. I could milk a goat and make cheese and prune the apple tree that thrived in part from my pee. I knew how to dig ditches. The endless bartering that I had experienced in rural Oregon, exchanges of eggs or zucchini or assistance, translated into expressions of love and generosity absent in the city. The only currency was money, and earning it was cleaved from any living, breathing, growing thing. I heard from those who trusted their lives to scientists who design their trucks and tractors, invent the chemicals concoctions for their fields, breed better cattle and crops, stock their rivers with trout, and they check their weather apps every single morning. But still, they wholly dismiss the scientists who dare speak of atmospheric concentrations of gases. I heard talking points passed down from right-wing think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and Cato Institute, and amplified by Fox News and @Real Donald Trump. I heard about natural cycles and sun flares, and we're just in a warming phase, and this all used to be under ice. I heard volcanoes were the reason ice sheets were melting. I heard farmers say they've seen worse. Could be cold as the Dickens next year. I emerged from these conversations across America sure of two things. First, reluctant Republicans like Craig, who is the fly fisherman that I met, they inhabit a space that is not ever newsworthy. You will not find him bubbling up on your social media feed. You will not hear his soft, deliberate voice on Fox or NPR. He is not going to Trump rallies, wearing t-shirts about stringing up journalists or driving his car into crowds. He still exists, and many, many more like him. Also, the refuters in Byron's Kitchen recited a script of climate change denial that seemed a subtext of a story about something much deeper and more visceral. To dismiss the science was to stick with your tribe, to stake out a claim about meaning and relevance in a changing world. It is an attempt to retrieve something irretrievably lost. It is a fight against one's own functional extinction. Deep is the nostalgia for a vanishing rural white America, one where boys don't disappear to college and girls stay home to marry and mother. But that world, of course, is gone, as is a world in which carbon in the atmosphere is below 350 parts per million. And in the peach orchards and on the cattle ranches of America, those two facts are colliding. We in the developed world created the conditions that made both of these conditions vanish. Together, we will have to reckon with what those changes mean. With Robert and Craig and so many other men and women I met, I couldn't shake a sense of familiarity. And it wasn't until later that it struck me. I was falling for these strangers because their words or what hid between their words reflected the same love I felt for the places that I had lived. Even the most skeptical of my sources and I would stand together on prairies, in hollows, agreeing about how unrecognizable so many of our home grounds have become. This then is the shared lament between the climate stubborn right, the Green New Deal left, and the majority, the vast majority who inhabit the space in between. The fundamental shared experience of the land shifting beneath our feet. Those I met were no less bereft than I was about the way the world is changing, even if the details varied. The culture wars will rage on, and the algorithmic news silos that we inhabit will accelerate their feed. But this one element links the aching loss felt on both sides. They are prisms of each other, shadow worlds, the same and different. Sometimes I allow myself to wonder if the extreme weather events, the droughts, the fires, the dying cattle, withered peaches, could unite us, everybody, everywhere, as we wrestle with this truly global crisis. Could the shared catastrophe be akin to gazing to the first iconic image of Earth from the Apollo 8 spacecraft in 1968? Oh, that's where we live, there. Because nowhere will be left untouched. This isn't the Irish potato famine where you could set sail for America. This isn't the Dust Bowl where you could move on to California. California's on fire. America's on fire. The planet is on fire. The Australian eco-philosopher Glenn Albrecht coined the term solastalgia to mean a pain or sickness caused by the loss or lack of solace and the sense of isolation connected to the present state of one's home and territory. But other words are emerging. The Dutch have come up with, please Vanessa, my student, forgive me, the Dutch have come up with landschapsjen, translated as landscape ache. In Welsh, herath refers to a homesickness for a place where you can no longer return to, or perhaps that was never there. In Portuguese, saudade describes the emotion of being infused with melancholy and longing for a loved one, a loved place. But more and more, I am reminded of an older word, bodhicitta, Sanskrit for awakened heart. It is that moment when you are overwhelmed by a great compassion for all around you and you finally let go of the attachment to yourself as a thing in isolation, something separate. The recognition of the web that holds us together, that prevents functional extinction, that in today's America could keep democracy alive. Many religious faiths affirm that we are all one in sickness and death, that only on the way into the ground or the flame or the vulture's craw can we find the universality of human experience. But we don't need cosmic or even global consciousness to find common ground here. Today, we are all inhabitants of what is rapidly becoming this uninhabitable earth. Though our places are different, we all share a sense of place loss. All we need to do to find what connects us is to look down at the dirt beneath our feet or stand at the edge of the chasm as the waters rise. And then, maybe then, we'll build a boat to cross. Warring tribes will make alliances, and the masses in the middle will coalesce, each calling their friends in the night, and together we'll get to work on the overdue task at hand. Thank you. Sorry, that was a little long. There's so much I'm still like processing there. I end on a hopeful note, but I am, to be completely honest, still struggling with how to reconcile it. And even just in the year since that essay was finished, the polarization continues to happen. And I think just we talk about going out and listening to people and trying to find those stories and we've been talking in workshops about how every human has their story and their drive. And I think we're beginning to forget that as we get all consumed by my profession, journalism. We hear the news, we hear the stories that rise to the top, but there's all these other stories out there. And so, right, that whole question about thinking about how to have action happen on the climate crisis, on how to get people to change their stories, right? So this is part, the facts, we have the facts. We have more than enough facts at this point. So moving to the stories, and then part of the evolution of that thinking was that we sort of lack the stories of what we're really working towards. We kind of know what we're working against at this point, but we don't, what is it gonna look like in the future? There's been some really interesting resonances happening now with the pandemic of behavior has changed wildly in a very short amount of time. What will stick, what will not stick, what is actually better in some ways, what is catastrophically worse in other ways. All of these things are coming up. And so I am completely a nonfiction writer. I cannot make up fiction at all. But a year ago February, I was in India with my family, visiting family there, and in these times reached out to me about doing like a speculative fiction, a letter from 2049. And so Allison, when you mentioned 2049, last night, 2 nights ago, I was like, I had kind of written this piece and kind of forgot about it. And then it came back to me really quickly with the pandemic because so many things just seemed like they sort of resonated. So I'm going to read what ended up being a letter to my dear cousin brother, Harish, who used to live in the US and he's gone back to India and he's there now, and I'm here now. And yeah, so let's shoot 30 years into the future. This one's a lot shorter. Dear Harish, hello, my sweet faraway cousin brother. As we approach our gasp 80th birthdays, I felt inspired to resurrect the old tradition of letter writing. Seems like yesterday we were sitting on your parents' rooftop, taking in the night sounds of Besant Nagar, drinking beer, in the days when I would impulsively buy a ticket from New York City to Chennai without much thought beyond my bank account balance. Remember when a ticket cost a few weeks' pay instead of 6 months? Has it really been 20 years since I last flew to India? I have forgotten the smell of the jasmine flowers women sold along the streets. Remind me again of their fragrance. Do you see more stars now that the coal plants have shut down? Are the streets quieter without the roar of motorbikes? I suspect the electrical vehicles still honk just as frequently and drive just as wildly. Perhaps everything is a little calmer without the overwhelming crowds, but I imagine there's an eeriness to that calm, knowing the cost at which it came. When I last saw you, the future seemed so dark. Would we ever have believed that the United States and India would actually be poised to meet the 2050 zero carbon goal? The great tumult of the 30s still lay ahead, when all those climate report warnings started to play out like weekly cinema releases, when we finally abandoned the word normal when talking about the weather, when the unnatural disasters and the spread of disease and the ticking up of temperatures forever silenced the songs of so many, from the golden bush robins of the Himalayas to Nilakadan's kids and our dear Aunt Devaki. It breaks me again, just thinking about that time. We Americans played such a big role in the problem. Man, did you and I lead the good life in those years in New York City. Really, Harish, did we even realize how decadent our lives had become? Every other month we were on a plane somewhere. I felt paralyzed about how to change the massive oil-infused infrastructure that made everything seem possible. I wanted to believe buying eco-friendly products and recycling would be enough. How foolish. Remember how I used to joke about using up the carbon footprint of the children that I decided not to have? The joke falls kind of flat now. Speaking of the next generation, let me put aside my dark ruminations and bring you bright tidings of my stepkids. Their generation has made me reconsider my cynical belief that it's human nature to consider your own needs first. I swear their brains are wired differently, like they can see the future in a way we just couldn't. A resurrection of deep time thinking that humans lost and are only beginning to find again. I say girls, but they're middle-aged now. The eldest is still lawyering, fighting for citizenship for international climate refugees. My younger stepdaughter's ethical clothing line is doing great. She never left Charlotte, North Carolina, where she went to school, one of those bustling inland cities. Her main store there teamed up with a shared workspace and a cafe, so the building is a community space as much as a shop. India's model of small automated factories powered by solar microgrids has really caught on here, and that's what her company does. Everything they make, design, and sell is sourced and manufactured locally. And with everything so local, the kids can tell where someone's from just by their clothes. Her line has defined the Carolina look. And when the fabric is spent at the end of its life, her store welcomes returns and they plug the material back into the production cycle. Remember when Cousin Pubby was working on this circular economy stuff back in Mumbai, way back in the teens, when it was still kind of new? Around the same time, China stopped taking the world's plastic scraps, I think it was, maybe 2018 or so. Sometimes I think this is the biggest change in our day-to-day lives since you and I last met, since we emerged from the darkness of the tumult. Not only are people vastly more aware of how fragile human life is and the slender skin that keeps this planet habitable, but we're also so much more aware of all the things around us, these objects of our lives that are born from some form of life somewhere, be it a cotton plant or substances dug up from the earth's strata. You always had a healthy relationship with your stuff, given your Buddhist tendencies, but you were rare in that respect. Now we're all a little Buddhist, I guess, forced to detach from so much and simultaneously compelled to pay closer attention to what remains, human and non-human alike. So the girls are doing great, but I have to admit, I am glad I didn't bring children into the world myself, despite my fear of regret. At first, it was because I wanted to put my energy and limited money into nonprofit work, then journalism, always travel. But eventually, I felt like I couldn't, in good conscience, look into the eyes of a child I knew would face a diminishing world, one without the old growth forests I fell in love with as a girl, one so transformed by climate change. It was such luck to have met S and his so lovely daughters, to get to taste such family life beyond my own role as daughter, sister, cousin. Back then, there were so few examples of how not to have children. It was seen as subversive instead of merely another way of being part of society. We didn't realize we were setting a trend, did we? S's youngest has a child, though, doing well as she stands on the threshold of adulthood. Of course, like her entire generation, she's traumatized by all she saw growing up during the tumult, the flooding and the droughts, the wildfires and the storm surges, so much death. But somehow she is still rooted in what I think of as the place of possibility. The young literally envision worlds we older folks can scarcely imagine. Sometimes I hear them talking about how this new economy will bring back the abundance of the last century. But I think they're right to dismiss what we say. It's clear we failed them, failed to consider their futures when we were young. They know this, and they're trying harder, concerned with what they're leaving behind, from clothing remnants to carbon dioxide. Does it feel that way in India too? This old lady's exhausted, Harish. I'll continue tomorrow. Next day. Well, refreshed as much as a 79-year-old lady can be. So the move to Tennessee, it was a smart one. Took a few years, but we're settled in now. We lost a lot of money on our old place in Cape Cod. It was just changing too fast, revealing itself to be the sandbar it always was with each new storm from the ever-lengthening hurricane season. But with friends, we were able to scrape together enough to make it to the Mecca that is this high plateau of the Southern Appalachians. There are 10 of us in the cluster home, built with the now standard modified concrete and wood, designed to sequester carbon in the walls, along with solar roof tiles, a solar hot water heating system, and only hyper-efficient Tripoli appliances. It can be challenging living with others. We were so used to our private single-family homes, but we have our own space within the building, and the shared electric vehicle works well enough. And it saves us all money. The best part, honestly, is the shared meals. Last night, someone made a delicious meal with veggies from the greenhouse and a hearty chickpea stew. We take turns cooking, and less cooking for each of us means more energy to experiment with all the new foods. Are the strict vegetarian Brahmins trying out all those new Beyond Beef products that are so popular here? I don't even miss meat anymore. Well, except for bacon. S is not as mobile as he once was, but when we do manage to go visit the girls, the new national rail system is, wow, it's just incredible. It's slightly outrageous that it took America my entire lifetime to develop a train infrastructure that India had back in the 1970s when you and I were children, and you could get anywhere in the country, even if it took days. To travel that last bit from train station to wherever you're going, there's the final mile system loaded with self-driving gizmos that still remind me of India's auto rickshaws, minus the buzzy, sputtering sound of the gas engine. Though there is a deep ache about not getting to wrap my arms around you and see all our relatives in India or to smell the jasmine, there is, I admit, some part of me that feels almost a sense of relief now that I don't need to spend the time, energy, and money zipping my way across the world. I suspect others who jet-setted our days through the early part of the century might feel it too now. Now that we simply can't afford to fly, screen visits feel so normal now. You can sense the shift in communities too. There's more focus on the local places we inhabit and the land we rely on together, like Wendell Berry was telling us all along. Just writing all this, my mind is tumbling back again to when we were young, as it does so often these days. Remember how in my early days of reporting, I wrote about the vultures that were there on their way to extinction in India, back at the turn of the century? It was then I first realized what nimble creatures we humans are, for better and worse. We have adjusted to the ever-shifting weather and stronger storms, our go bags at the ready and battery backups always charged. Back then I wrote, the vulture's disappearance is catastrophic, yes, but the ability to adapt is stunning, or terrifying, or both. No matter how bad things get, how many species get wiped from the earth, the living go on. And we do, but not all of us. It's like a physical weight, my mourning for those who didn't make it through the tumult. Though we have found some planetary tranquility, we have done so at immeasurable cost, forged by fire. It's time to sign off, my dear Harish. There's only one place to get this actual letter on a boat to you, which should depart tomorrow. I'm saving my pennies, so to speak. Remember those? So maybe I can book passage on that ship someday to see you just once more. Or there's a place for you here if you want to return. Should I make it, I'll bury my nose in a bundle of jasmine and we can hobble up to a rooftop and remember a time when we thought the world couldn't change. And then it did.
So
Thank
unmute ourselves.
you.
Thank you.
Meera, thank you. Thank you.
So much.
So good.
So beautiful.
So let's go out there and tell new stories. That's what we were doing all week, right?
Yeah.
Do you want to take some questions? Or what would you like to do here?
Yeah, I would love to take questions.
Okay.
I'm out of words. Yeah, questions?
There's a comment. Where's the emoji for standing ovation?
That's sweet. Thank you.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Oh,
Please put your questions in the Q&A if you're in the audience, and those in the gallery, if you have a question, just jump right in.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. This was so just, I was transported with you. I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about your process, particularly on longer term projects when I imagine you have like a stack of notebooks. How do you decide kind of what gets culled into the final piece and maybe what is a second offshoot that could be a different story or that you put to the side? How do you kind of corral everything into what we heard?
it's really hard because I really did like just fall in love with everybody I was meeting. Like I just heard so many good stories, and the challenge with narrative journalism is you can't tell 100 stories. You have to tell 2 or 3 really powerful stories that seem emblematic of everything that you saw from those other 97. So that part is really hard because I just met so many amazing people that you feel like you're not doing justice to to the stories that they shared with you. So that part is actually really difficult. And the process of figuring, I mean, that was challenging on each individual story level. And then when it comes time to like think about an essay that's trying to bring it all together, I did end up kind of staying focused with the people that I did focus on in the stories. But even that, I'm still feeling like I didn't even scratch the surface. I feel like there is more to say there because there's still so many people that I met that brought up other fine points that are really relevant in talking about how we're thinking about climate change in this country now, especially on the conservative side. So there's no easy answer. It always feels incomplete.
There's a question in the Q&A, and then we can get Scott's question. The question's from Emily, and it is, I am curious when it comes to including people in their real lives, are there any challenges you face with trying to keep them satisfied? Any tips you have found along the way?
Yeah, I mean, listening, being compassionate, being honest, not trying to put something on the page that the person would recognize themselves on some deeper level, I think is the most important thing. I always share, and I think this is actually a really important thing on the craft level of every single person that I talk to in the process of the story gets the announcement about the story coming out, you know, along with like the exactly what you just brought up, Elle, about like all the people, like, I'm sorry, even if you weren't in the, even if you didn't make it into the story, you informed the story, you informed my thinking about the story. I've heard so many stories from sources of people saying, oh, this journalist came through and they never even sent us, you know, they did some TV program, I never saw it. So I think that that feeling like that journalists steal stories, I feel like I try to do my best at giving that back. And I've never had anybody write me saying, you got it wrong, or you bastard, like, I haven't heard any negative. I'll hear either silence or people will write something nice, but it's and I've stayed in touch with some of the people that I met on that journey. I mean, one possible, like, what if I went back, you know, like 5 years after the first trip and go see where all those people are, like, what are they thinking? Our Yale survey is showing that more and more people from the middle are becoming more and more concerned around climate. Like, what would I see if I went back to some of these same places? So there's always, like, that's the hard part. I always like, I want to do that for India too, now here. But does that answer, I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, I think so. There's another question. Oh, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Question.
As a follow-up, did you, in the process here, did you show people what you were going to publish before you published it, or?
No, that is, I mean, it's a journalistic standard that you do not show people any copies of what you're doing. You can fact check, you know, meaning you might be verifying, and some magazines like actually like do call up every single person and kind of verify that the quote is of the spirit that they said. But no, I mean, it's on the record, and I make it very clear what I'm working on. And I met people who didn't want to talk to me and then proceeded to talk, and then I would have to clarify, is this on the record? And they're like, no, don't. So then that was just background, and they would not be included. But yeah, I followed the journalistic standard that no, you never share your copy, your work in process. Yeah, I think Scott, you had a question.
Yeah, Meera, that was wonderful. Both of them were. I had, of course, read the Orion piece in the winter, and I'm delighted to hear it again with your voice on it and your interpretation. And the letter is beautiful, heartrending but beautiful. Wendell Berry, whenever we're together, laments the fact, as he sees it, the fact that neither political party ever pays serious attention to rural America, to the destruction of rural communities, to the fact that farmers cannot earn a living. unless they're corporations. And his main source of information about what the world is saying about rural America, if anything, is the New York Times, which he reads daily. But so far as I can tell, he doesn't look at television, and he doesn't look at any other major news sources. Do you think his assessment is fair that really neither political party in their platforms or in their policymaking really address the problems of rural America? And that matters not only for humanitarian and moral reasons, it matters because the people in the Dakotas and Georgia peach farmers are getting stories that enable them to turn away any notion of climate change. They're getting stories from sources that, for whatever reason, they feel are more sympathetic to their plight than Inside Climate News or the New York Times or Grist, so on. So do you have any thoughts about how rural America is or is not attended to by the press?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think rural America is not attended to by most anybody. I mean, politicians or journalists. I think that there's a lot of lack of acknowledgement of, there is fierce pride in people who, we are very dependent in cities on all of these things coming from the outside, and lack of recognition of the people who are behind making that happen. And so that is with that void, I think the tricky thing is that then the identity and the tribal politics is what takes over, because the issues are not being addressed. On the conservative side, they're not getting the attention they should to the rural issues, I would argue. But they are getting attention on the tribal politics level, and I think that's the thing that's rising to the top. Yeah.
Thank you.
Now again, you're just feeling threatened, and the human nature is to dig in response to that. Yeah. Should I go through the looking up? Which one was next?
Yeah, I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
Built off where Elle was going, all the data, all the journals, and putting together all those facts and deciding what you're going to function on. Is there in that process at all an idea also about the length of the piece that you want, or something that's much more structured?
Yeah, I mean, the working with Inside Climate News was a really great process. They gave me a tremendous amount of leeway in terms of these stories. But we were working, I mean, it's online, so there is a slight movement, but we were working on I think it was about a 3,500 word count for each of the stories. And they all came in, around there. And knowing that was the framework, we talked this week in the workshops about constraints and how they can be good. So I had a word count that I was working with, and really it was trying to bring together big ideas that were going on around arguments around how people are arguing about it and how people are thinking about it or how people are not thinking about it, and really just trying to get at that underneath layer about the drive and what other factors are at play. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, kind of thinking about the book, your book that you put out.
For sure. Yeah. Oh my gosh, that was really, really challenging. I mean, that was it was my first book, and I kind of deliberately, I was very fortunate to come up in a brainstorm with some friends about the structure of it. So I came up with using the 5 elements to tell 5 different narrative stories from around the country. So not wanting to write some encyclopedia about environmental devastation in India, zeroing in. So, Earth was organic, the rise of organic agriculture in response to the Green Revolution and water restoration projects and the vulture crisis that's happening there in South Asia. So each one focused on a particular thing. So I was able to actually work on it with about a 15,000 word chapter. So it was a little bit easier for me to see how to tackle each section individually. Like I have not written a book that has one, this had unified themes, but it didn't have one unified. So I have not bit off that that endeavor yet. But within that, I was trying to bring together that whole science and storytelling back and forth, because I would do a lot of academic peer-reviewed journal research and interview hard scientists about what was going on about cancer in Punjab and water tables and pollutants and air pollution and all these different like very hard science work. And then the thing that is so fascinating for me as a science journalist has been to go out there and talk to people and see if what people are experiencing in their real lives does or does not echo what the literature is saying. Because sometimes these, you know, I'm a total science geek, so I love all of that work. But then if it doesn't match reality, and this really came to light in the Side Climate News series, you know, then something has to happen. Otherwise, you've just got this disconnect where, you know, so that part was really fascinating, to go do the science, match it up with the stories and see what fits and what doesn't fit. And I would just go kind of back and forth between the two modes within the chapters. So we'd be out with farmers, and then we'd be talking, you know, about what was going on with the water table and chemicals in the soil and soil science and stuff like that.
Cool, thank you.
Sure. Would you see political spectrum idea is so potent? Would you see an infographic or small video for that concept? Yeah, we could just get a spirograph, like red and blue, and then it will all become purple. But yeah, if anybody wants to talk to me about doing a video, that'd be awesome. How are you as a journalist when you can't travel? Who are you? Oh my God. That's such an existential question. I mean, I have been at odds. In the letter from 2049, I have been at odds and feeling the burden of how my carbon footprint and my running around to do stories. And I deliberately, after the book was done, I wanted to work on stories closer to home in order to try to address that. And it was fortunate that the Inside Climate News series came together, because I was able to do that, mostly with, you know, travel on the ground for the most part. But now I'm still kind of trying to figure it out, because I just emerged from this year of teaching, literally just a few weeks ago. So I haven't fully stepped back into being a journalist, and I will be doing that as of Monday, basically. But it's going to be being done remotely at this point. So I'm going to be figuring that out, like many journalists are. I was supposed to go to India and continue writing about the vultures this fall, and I don't think that that's going to happen. So this is all a work in progress, and I'm not really sure how that's going to unfold. I think getting creative. Back in grad school, I was writing about vulture extinction in India without ever having seen a vulture, by doing Skype interviews and digging up old archival material so that you can feel like you're at a place. You know, if you're a good interviewer, you can get people who are somewhere else to tell you exactly what it's like what it's really like to be there. Of course, it's not the same, but these are all part of being a journalist that I'm sure will come in handy in the time to come. Another process question: how do you approach exploring stories on issues as divisive as climate change in small town or red state America without closing off? Or is this not as much of an issue as I think it is? I'm a small town guy, and my small town as well. It has changed a lot in not so great ways. I kind of touched on this, I think, during our craft talk, Liz, that I find that one of the biggest problems I think we have in our culture is that we're not very good at listening to each other. And that when you show up in a small town, I mean, usually I'd be in these places for at least a week and sometimes longer. And usually that town means that's like Main Street is like 4 blocks long. So literally, like me saying that I was like a stray dog, that's kind of, I like to become the town stray dog, basically. And I'll just be like hanging around, and like by the end, they're inviting you to barbecue. And you just become part of the fixture. And I think that is, a lot of times I would literally run out of actual questions that I'd come, that were in my notepad, by the first day, but I had all these new questions and all these new relationships are forming. And then I'm just having a conversation. Most of the time I'm just listening to them. And it's actually surprising how little people would be like, so where are you coming from? Why are you, like, they wouldn't ask me anything. They just, like, people love to share their stories, right? Like it's, and there are very few opportunities for people to really sit and listen. I mean, we used to be storytellers, right? That's why we're all here right now this week, is because we are have evolved to be storytellers, and we used to sit and listen to each other's stories a lot more, and we don't do that very much anymore. I can remember the time that I went back to India and TVs had entered the household, and suddenly no one was listening to Patti anymore. We were all just the TV was on blaring, and the stories kind of just stopped suddenly. And so going into small towns and just going without being there to tell them anything, just to listen, to say, your peach crop failed. What are you making of this? I just found people were very open, and even when people were resistant, they would, I had this amazing, I still haven't written about it, but this one of the West Virginia small town people, somebody kept saying, go to the gun shop owner. They're these, they're military couple in the gun shop. They were really great after the floods. You should go talk to them. And I was nervous. I wasn't sure what, and I went, and they were the husband was there, and he was very, very skeptical of me. And I just kind of stayed, and then we ended up having a 3-hour conversation, and he brings down his wife, and we have a talk for another hour. And I think that there's just way more bridges than we think that they are, and it just takes time of sitting and listening to each other to recognize them. How did you actually choose your interviewees? Did you find any non-white subjects in listening to climate change denial story? Very few. The maps, following the Trump voting county level maps took me to white places. I did talk to a lot of women, so I didn't have them in what I read tonight, but I met women ranchers. So there were women in there, but I know there are conservative African-American and maybe indigenous, but it's hard. It wasn't those two. That Venn diagram was not there. So it basically, these stories led me to basically white communities. But there were some interesting things going on with labor that I barely touched on the Orion piece, but it was a larger piece in the peach farmer story, and I also did a story on the Gulf Coast of Texas, just about Latino labor, because I just hint at it in the Orion story, is that Robert Dickey was saying, I can't find white people to do this work. They will not do this work. They'll come, they quit by noon. His entire labor force was Latino. Oyster companies as well down on the Gulf Coast, and they can't find white people to do work, and that's what they were telling me. So it was the changes in labor and the lack of recognition of what that really means is also a huge part of this equation, I think. How did you actually choose your interviewees? So I'd always do a bunch of interviews over the phone. I did tons of just the Venn diagram that I was working on to try to find places was I would look at national climate assessment and state reports, and basically just figure out what areas we're going to be facing what crises. There's a whole, there's sea level rise, there's wildfires, there's drought, there's impacts on agriculture, there's heavy storm events. So there's all these, and then there's sporting and recreation, the fly fishing and the dog sledding. So I had all those general ideas in my mind about stories that could be possibilities. And then I was looking for places where they were particularly focused, like the National Climate Assessment says the Southeast is going to be especially hard hit in terms of agriculture from climate change. The Northeast by sea level rise and heavy and intense storms and heavy precipitation events. So certain things were taking me to certain areas. I do just a lot of research. Sometimes I'd reach out to journalists and people that I knew in those states to see if they had local input. And then I would just start making calls and, you know, eventually get to a point of like, you know, talking to the ranchers in North Dakota, like, hey, can I come? You know, make contact with at least a few people on the ground. And then always once I got on the ground, and this happened in India too, if you have a few people that can help welcome you into a community, then you just start meeting everybody else once you're there on the ground. Okay, as a journalist, how was it for you to write the fiction piece you read? Was it difficult, freeing, frightening, something else? And do you plan to write more fiction? Oh, I don't plan to write any more fiction, but that was really fun. It was fun. I mean, I was definitely drawing heavily from the experiences that I had in Oregon, where we were living more communally and living in a way that is very not mainstream America. So I was drawing on experiences from the past, but yeah, it was freeing and it was a little frightening, but it was fun. The fun thing I'm doing now is I'm going to be working with an illustrator to do a young adult graphic comics nonfiction about climate change activism for kids. So like this part is just fun, of just thinking about how to tell stories in different ways to different audiences. I think that's part of keeping me interested in just approaching things from different angles. That ending of the letter where we've learned to live different, yet Cape Cod continues to disappear is so compelling. Do you believe that it is our future, or are you less optimistic that we humans will change our ways? Depends on which minute of which hour of which day you ask me about how I answer that. Sometimes I feel really, really frustrated, and then other times, you know, you gain some historical perspective and you realize we have made a lot of huge changes in really short order. There's this moment where I'm exploring this in the book, where there's this beautiful area in South India that has these gigantic boulders, and they're just kind of like, there's one that's called Krishna's Butterball. It's this huge thing, and everybody goes and, you know, puts their finger underneath it because it looks like you're just gonna like be crushed by this thing, but it's not going anywhere. But it is going somewhere, right? At some point, that boulder will shift. And so, you know, I was driving around this area with all, you know, at sundown, and all these boulders are like, you know, they look like they could just come down and clobber your car in 1 second, but they've been there. But then something shifts and things do change. And they usually change when we least expect them. So that's what gives me hope. And perceptions have been changing around a lot of things. And so that keeps me going. High Country News is stepping up now for a few years. Yeah, they're a great publication. When writing about climate change, who is your audience? People in the US or people everywhere affected by climate change? That is a global audience, especially in the globally disempowered. If the audience is global, what are the different craft decisions when writing for a global audience? Yeah, I mean, the book, especially the book that I wrote came out in India and the US. So two different publishers, two different titles and covers, but the same book. And I was very much writing for an Indian audience as well as an American audience, which was a little bit challenging. But I think that part of what I was trying to say in that is that there has been, there are so many things that places like India, where you have a high population and limited natural resources, like what they're doing right and wrong is really instrumental for everyone globally. And I think that a lot of times when I was going to India, there's a strong kind of not so pretty streak of nationalism going on in India just since this book came out that deeply troubles me. But for many years, India was very, in my impression was when I would go there, that people would just be like, oh, you're American, and they hold up this American ideal. And, you know, in the process of writing this book, I was arguing that if India can get this right and create a new model of sustainable development for the 21st century, they could teach that to the world. like they are lacking in infrastructure. There are lots of gaps. They are not locked into driving everywhere. They are not, you know, there's all these ways that they could create the infrastructure that they do need for a large part of their population in a totally new way. And the comparison I have there is that India liberated itself from colonial power in a way that no country on the face of the earth had ever done. And they did it successfully. And it was, you know, a generation later that Martin Luther King Jr. here in this country was replicating what was happening there, right? So to say that India, oh, you know, all the answers have to come from the developed areas, no, we've fucked it up in a lot of ways. And it's been clearly apparent how we've failed in a lot of respects, in spite of the technology and the supposed brain power and supposed economic powers. And so we need to look elsewhere for those. And it's been great having Robin Wall-Kimmerer and talking so much about Indigenous knowledge as well here in this country, in every country that has been holding on to these traditions that were there all along. Do you ever have a broad idea of what you want to write about and then run into differing opinions during your interviews? What do you do with those opposing opinions? Incorporate or leave out? I try to keep them in. I mean, I think that's the wonderful messiness. I mean, in the Fly Fisherman, I met two of the people that I focused on. One was a frustrated Republican who continues to vote Republican because he believes in small business and he's pro-life, but he sees the changes when he's fly fishing. He sees hatches coming out a month early. He knows that his beloved sport is in danger and his business. And then down the road, there's another outfitter who's just like, we can't change anything. This is, the weather's always changed. It's going to change back. You know, this is just a little blip. And so, yeah, I include those because that is, that's the reality. There's people are, you know, Yale has these, Center for Climate Communication has the 7 Americans, these kind of archetypes of people, and there's the alarmed and there's the dismissive. And, you know, I met the dismissives and they were there on the page too, but I was also trying to show that when you look at the numbers, it's mostly in the middle. You know, people are just busy going about their lives and trying to carry on, and they're not thinking about these things one way or the other until they're like in their backyard, which they are. So yeah, put the messiness on the page. Can you speak to Arundhati Roy's work on climate in India? Yeah, I mean, I haven't, I'll be honest that I haven't been super up to date on what she's been doing lately, but yeah, she was instrumental. I came to very much the same conclusion of what she was writing about, of just, you know, this kind of small is beautiful, that there's the small nimble systems or across a landscape can be transformative in a way that big, huge infrastructure, which is expensive and has a lot of unintended consequences, is different. So she's been really vocal. Tell us about your process for interviewing subjects. Did you let the interview develop organically, or did you direct it with questions? Could you prompt responses that were surprising? Oh yeah, so I always have like some questions that I go into it. Try to be very open-ended questions, you know, don't ask yes and no questions, ask questions that are kind of messy. There's a fabulous, I don't know if there's a way I can share it with the conference attendees, but there's this, I'm not gonna remember her name. If you Google 22 questions to complicate the narrative, there's a woman, a journalist, who looking at political questions, it's basically just like trying to get to the deeper level of what people are thinking about and trying to get past these really simple things. Let me see if I can find it really quick. Or if somebody does and then wants to throw it in the box. And it was great. I actually, when I was teaching at Princeton in the fall, I taught a class that was built off of this Inside Climate News series that was getting into all of the messiness about the sociocultural reasons why this is debated in this country. Okay, yes, so yeah, here it is. It was from Solutions Journalism. Can I post to the? Can I type an answer here? Does that work?
Yes, you can do that.
Okay, good. Let's see if that works. Okay, I just threw that up there. I don't know. Amanda Ripley, correct. That's the author. So I had the students paired off and ask these questions of each other, and they basically are just much more open-ended questions, like that help you get into just some of the more complicated stories of what people are thinking about. Yeah, what is oversimplified about this issue? Where do you feel torn? Is there something about the other side's position that makes sense to you? You know, just basically diving into the complications and the contradictions that we experience instead of trying to shy away from them, and then trying to get to like a deeper level of what's going on. I mean, because there were multiple questions going on. They're driving questions about like, what are you seeing? Like, do you see climate change? And I was hearing so many people say they are seeing changes. Like almost everybody recognizes the changes that are happening. It's the explanation of what's causing those changes, and what we should do about them. Those are the two things that then become sticking points. But to just say whether or not they're seeing changes, everybody's seeing changes. Yeah. How does a journalist handle an interview when someone says something that you morally, ethically, scientifically completely disagree with? Is it in a redirect, a way of questioning? I'm not there to argue with them. I mean, that is something that's kind of liberating, is that I am there to listen. I will push back when people say, I mean, in terms of the Inside Climate News series, if people said something that was just, I knew to be completely factually incorrect, I would push them on it a little bit. But I didn't argue with them about it. You know, I would just push the questioning. I wouldn't just say like, you know, I'm not a dictaphone, so I'm not just like writing down without any engagement. The interview should be an evolving conversation, and that's the beauty of it. I mean, you are trying to do this like, you know, some element of forced intimacy, and that comes from willing to go to slightly uncomfortable places, even if you're doing that pretty quickly. And I try to be very forthright. You know, if people ask me things about myself or what I think, I will share them. So I'm not, you know, I don't try to be this blank slate, you know, like I'm trying to make a connection with people. And so I do offer that. But like I said before, very, very few people would want to share their stories. Yeah, Amanda Ripley. Good. What drew you into nonfiction and journalism rather than the other genres? I guess I just have a terrible imagination, I guess. I mean, the stories are they're just all there. I mean, I wrote all my life. I've always kept a journal. I used to do tons of letter writing back when that used to be a thing. And I went into nonprofit work and was doing that all through my 20s, and I was doing more and more like grant writing, and then some girlfriends and I started a zine back in the last days of the zine called Rural Girls back in Oregon, and we had that going for like 4 years, and that was when I first started like writing essays, and it was the first time I started rewriting, which I was like, oh, you can like rewrite it and make something better, and that was. I've always just been, there's so much out there when I travel, and just life. I just find life full of stuff to write about, and I've never been good at just making stuff up. So I write poetry, but I would never show anybody. That's just private. Anything else? How are we doing on time?
Maybe one more question if there's one. Perhaps someone in the gallery has one. If someone wants to put one in the Q&A. Sarah, is your hand up?
How do you generate your questions? So before you hit the road, what thinking do you do to kind of create a list of things you're looking for? And I'm sure you add to that list as you go, but how do you generate those questions?
usually just through the research that I'm doing. The questions just generate pretty naturally from either, you know, reading papers or reading other people's work about a particular situation. So that's, yeah, it does feel like it rises pretty organically. I mean, I think the hardest part is like with the book, I was collecting all these other books on India and, you know, a huge bookshelf full of fiction about Parsis who are the ones who deal with the vultures and the dead bodies, you know, like there was just so many, like all these books, like historical and books on gender and scientific books, all these different things. And I had trouble. I wish I could have sat down and read all of those books before I went out reporting, but instead I was kind of doing it like this. I was doing it back and forth and back and forth. And so that part was a little bit challenging. Like, I think, you know, when I would sometimes come across something later and I'm like, oh, I wish I'd known that to ask that question when I was there. And sometimes I can reach back out. I definitely do have multiple people that I would have constant back and forth. And even once you're gone, you know, you have all their contact information, you call them up. And again, people are happy to talk. They're happy to clarify positions. I love following scientists, and scientists are so passionate about their work and they spend so much time on it that just being able to engage them with it and ask more questions, I find they're very, extremely helpful. And if, you know, you can get them off of just giving you scientific jargon and start telling you stories about why the hell they care about plankton or whatever tiny little thing it is, then yeah, there's just a lot of information and wonderful stories there.
Thank you.
So speaking of stories, it's been such a pleasure this entire week hearing. I'm so inspired. I feel like I've been in class, so it's been really great.
Thank you, Meera. I'm so glad again that you accepted our invitation. Gallery, could you please unmute yourselves so we can give her a round of applause?